Thanks for listening to the Thoughts on the Adventist Message podcast. My hope is that all who hear this podcast will reconsider their understanding of what it means to preach the three angels' messages to the world. I'm certain I haven't figured it all out, but I hope that these episodes spark conversations that can bring us to realize God's full desire for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so we see that Satan's efforts to counteract the establishment and the spread of the gospel, of the kingdom of God, fail miserably, but his efforts to counterfeit that kingdom and that gospel succeed beyond his wildest dreams. In this episode, we're looking at God's response, but before getting into that, I want to go a little deeper into the nature of God's gospel versus the gospel of Satan. Satan succeeds, as the Bible says, all the world will marvel after the beast, all the world will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life. He succeeds because he has designed a gospel that fits very nicely with the natural human tendency. We prefer to have an experience where I can just do a few external things, not do a few external things, say a few things, don't say certain things, be in the right place for the right amount of time and in the right way. And if I can do that, I can have the rest of my life. I can have my internal do whatever I can want. I can hate, I can be jealous, I can be vindictive, I can be mean, I can be all of these things as long as I do a few external things. We prefer that with the natural human tendency, the natural human soul. And so Satan's provided this cheaper alternative, but that cheaper alternative, though it seems on the surface to provide some degree of comfort, some degree of peace, because we think that we're doing what God requires of us, it's not the full thing. It's not the full strength Tylenol. It's not able to bring that lasting, long-term inner joy, inner peace, inner righteousness, that purity of heart. But Satan, of course, has designed this thing that is completely external because he knows that internally, once we focus on the inside, we'll see that his gospel is entirely bankrupt. Nothing that is externally based can do anything to give us overcoming power over our sinful nature, can give us genuine inner peace with ourselves, with others, and with God. Nothing that is strictly external can work on the inside. And so Satan's efforts is to distract us from the insides. On the other hand, God's gospel, as God's worship, God's kingdom is within you, as Jesus says. It's entirely an effort to transform us internally. We see the love of God, like we looked at in Luke chapter 7 with Mary's experience. We see his forgiveness. We see his patience with us. We see his kindness, and that transforms us on the inside. It causes a genuine response of love, of gratitude, of adoration, of affection towards God that begins a transforming work inside, and then it shows itself externally. But God's gospel is inside to change the outside. Satan's effort is to ignore the insides while operating only on the outside. This is the counterfeit. And this is the counterfeit that has had great success. And I want to say it's had great success across all denominations, without denomination, across all religions, without religions. There is no individual human who has not been affected by this counterfeit gospel. It doesn't matter that I've been born and raised Seventh-day Adventist. I personally have been very, very inclined to accept this version, this perversion of the gospel. I prefer to just do external things, to just pay an amount of money externally. I prefer that than having to deal with the internal thoughts of envy, having to deal with the lust of my heart, having to deal with transforming and working with the Spirit of God to confess the depravity of my soul and have his power to overcome that. I prefer to just do the externals, just work good for the church, just serve in the church, just help with the worship and have that version of the gospel. I prefer that. And That been Seventh-day Adventist my entire life. Satan's efforts have been quite successful, and yet still God has a response that is more successful than Satan's response. That response is in Revelation chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14 begins talking about the 144,000. We'll skip over that in verses 1 through 5, and we see God's response take place ultimately in verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. My feeling is that perhaps some of the angels thought, well, God, what are you going to do? It looks like Satan is being very successful in this effort to counterfeit the gospel. All the world is wandering after him. What are you going to do? Are you going to do some miracles? Are you going to show that you can do mightier miracles than he can do? Are you going to establish your kingdom physically? Are you going to overturn some of the kingdoms of Satan and have your people on top and win over governments and be able to rule by military might? What are you going to do, God, in response to Satan's efforts? Because his efforts seem to be well nigh universal. He seems to have the entire world. God's response says, no, I'm not going to do all of that. I'm not going to focus on anything that may go back towards Satan's efforts. I'm not going to focus on anything that's external. Signs and wonders, external military kingdoms, and efforts to do things that are impressive. All of those operate on the external. All of those operate outside. And if God were to succumb to that kind of a war with Satan, he would just be playing by Satan's rules. God says, what I'm going to do is the same thing I did in the beginning. I'm simply going to proclaim the everlasting gospel. I'm going to proclaim the truth, that an internal experience, an internal response to the love of Jesus, that and only that is the everlasting gospel. It doesn't matter what you do on the outside. It doesn't matter what you've done, where you go on the outside. All of that cannot in any way distract from what's going on in the soul, because what goes on in the soul, what goes on internally, that then will transform the outside. That then will transform what we do, what we say. But the focus of God is internal. You look in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus in verse 23 and onward through that part, he talks to the Pharisees and says, you emphasize all of these external things, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity and every foul thing. You are like whitewashed tombs. They look great outside. You're making it to church every Sabbath. You're paying your tithe. You're an elder. You're a deacon. You're doing all of these things externally, but internally your heart is far from me and you're worshiping me in vain. What God says is, I'm going to simply present the everlasting gospel. What I want to point out here is that God's response is not to simply proclaim that the seventh day is the Sabbath. However, the seventh day being the Sabbath plays an integral part here, because the seventh day Sabbath is one of the few commandments that can only be kept in the heart. Of course, that sounds strange initially, because if you've been Adventist anywhere near as long as me, you know that it's very easy, we think, to keep the fourth commandment as an external ritual. However, a very popular verse within Adventism, Isaiah chapter 58, actually says that the Sabbath is not possible to be kept externally. Isaiah 58 verse 13, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day. Yes, that involves the externals, but then he says this, you must call the Sabbath a delight. A delight is something that can only be realized internally. It doesn't matter how much I do, even if I'm smiling, even if I'm laughing and doing external things. I'm not genuinely calling the Sabbath a delight unless that's an internal experience. And so what God is saying here is that it doesn't matter how much of the Sabbath regulations externally I keep. If I'm not genuinely from my heart calling the Sabbath a delight, I'm dishonoring him. I am transgressing the fourth commandment. And so the Sabbath actually becomes a very valid, a very valuable test of the true versus the false, because those who are genuinely able to keep the Sabbath, those who are genuinely able to call the Sabbath a delight, are only those who delight themselves in the Lord. Though only those who genuinely enjoy spending time in the presence of God, who genuinely enjoy thinking of his goodness to them, genuinely enjoy thinking of his love and their response to that love. Only those can call the Sabbath a delight, and so only those can actually keep the Sabbath. But those who can't wait for the sun to set, like I have so many Sabbaths done, those who can't wait to get out for the regulations of the Sabbath, those who are just going through the motions of not doing work, not watching this or not watching that, not doing X, Y, and Z, those who are going through those, they are not keeping the fourth commandment. And so those who are accepting a external version of the gospel, though they may externally seem to be keeping the Sabbath, are still in harmony with Satan's gospel. God's response then, and the work of the group of individuals who say they are proclaiming his message at this last day, is not merely to proclaim Sabbath keeping as an external ritual, but to proclaim the everlasting gospel that goes internally, that operates internally, and then shows itself externally. And this is why I believe God has raised up the Seventh-day Adventist Church to present, yes, these three angels' messages, to present the everlasting gospel in contrast to the counterfeit gospel, the internally focused religion versus the externally focused perversion of the gospel. Finally, I want to close with a passage from The Great Controversy, a book by Ellen White. This is on page 448 of The Great Controversy. She says, "But Christians of past generations observed the Sunday, supposing that in so doing they were keeping the Bible Sabbath. And there are now true Christians in every church, not accepting the Roman Catholic communion." This does not exclude Roman Catholics. There are true Christians in the Roman Catholic Church who honestly believe that Sunday is the Sabbath of divine appointment. Think about this. She's saying these people are doing an incorrect external action. They're doing something that's wrong. It's not God's will for them to observe Sunday as the Sabbath. They're doing something wrong externally, but she says they're doing it honestly. They're doing it sincerely. They're doing it from the heart, believing that this wrong external action is an expression of their love and their gratitude for God. What is her comment on that? She says in the next sentence, God accepts their sincerity of purpose and their integrity before him. God accepts their sincerity of purpose and their integrity before him. What Ellen White is saying is that those individuals in the Roman Catholic Church who got it, who have understood as far as they are able, have grasped the everlasting gospel, who have an internally focused worship of God that may even express itself incorrectly externally. She says God accepts them. As we looked at, God accepts that kind of worship. The converse of that, obviously, is that that there are now false Christians. This is not Ellen White saying this, I'm saying this, but this is, I believe, the logical converse of what she says. There are now false Christians in every church not accepting the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who don't honestly believe that they are working out from an internal place, revealing that in their external action of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. So they may be doing the external work properly, may be observing the Sabbath externally, but if it's not tied to an internal experience, as Jesus said, in vain they do worship me. And so this puts the issue at hand. The issue, again, is not proclaiming external observation of the seventh-day Sabbath. The issue is the everlasting gospel. The issue is an internally focused religion that shows itself on the outside in contrast to an external religion. Whether that external religion is the observance of Mass, whether that external religion is worshiping of Hindu gods, whether that external religion is keeping the Sabbath as an external form. All of those are to be condemned by those who proclaim the three angels' messages, because all of those are manifestations of the perversion of the gospel. And I believe this is God's response to Satan's counterfeit.